So if there's a match, I want to store that number in that particular position using our index in another array. Remember, I wanted to return an array of match numbers. So first of all, we need to create that array, right? So I'm going to create an integer array, and I'm going to call it matched numbers. So first of all, I'm going to set it equal to the length of any of these arrays, right? Because they are going to all have the same number of elements, right? So I can use the length of, let's say, lottery numbers, right? That makes sense because that's the lottery numbers. All right, so I'm going to set it equal to the length of that lottery numbers. Well, first of all, I can't do that directly, right? I need to, this is just a class that variable that's going to hold an integer array. So I need to now create the array. I'm creating a new integer array, and I need to specify the length of it. And the length of it is going to be the length of the lottery numbers array. So lottery numbers dot length. All right. So anytime you initialize an array this way, or you set the size of the array this way, it's going to be assuming that the user, so again, don't worry about the length. The length is going to be defined by the constructor. The user is going to provide a number of lottery numbers. So assuming the user provided 5 lottery numbers, then an array will have something like 5, well, okay, so with regards to this array here, because it wouldn't have initial values, this is an array we're just creating. When we set the length of it, by default, the elements of the array are going to be 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, assuming that there are 5 lottery numbers. If we create this array called match numbers, it will store these numbers 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. Okay, what I want us to do is to replace these 0, 0, 0, 0 with the value -1. So I wanted to change the values from 0, 0, 0, 0, 0 to -1, -1, -1, -1, -1. Why do I want to create a -1? Because we have to understand that lottery numbers is going to contain numbers in the range of 0 through 9. If we store zeros here, and there's a 0 in the lottery numbers, that's a match, right? But that's not the intention of right? It's possible that a user won't have a 0 in here, or it's possible the user will have a 0. Let's change it -1, because -1 won't be part of the numbers in the lottery numbers array, right? So that means that when we return this array, when this array is returned to the other program, we're going to look through the array, and we are going to only, let's say we wanted to print out all the match numbers. First of all, if we change it to -1, we change it to -1. If there's a match over here, we're going to replace that -1 value to that number that matched. So this array, once it's done, after an example of, let's say, this loop, once it's done, it will have, first of all, if we change it to -1, it will look something like this. But if it goes through this array and let's say there's a match with the first element, and that number was, let's say, 9, or also, let's say 7. The second element, there wasn't a match, so it stays at -1. The third element, there wasn't a match, so it stays at -1. The fourth element, there was a match, and the number was, let's say, 6. So after this, after that iteration, the array will look something like this. Let's go back. With this same example here, let's say there wasn't a match here, but there was a match here in the third position here, and that match was 9. And there wasn't a match here, but there was a match here, which is 3. So let's change this to 3. So after we go through this array, okay, we go through the two arrays to compare the numbers. The match numbers array will look something like this. Assuming we wanted to print out just the match numbers, in our other program, we're going to loop through this array, and we're going to check if that number is not a -1, print it out. And so it's going to print out 9 and 3. But if you set it to 0, right, and the user has 0 in their lottery numbers array, then there can be a problem, because the user may not. The user may have 0 as one of their lottery numbers, but because this array had initially zeros in there, it considers that that's supposed to be a match, right? But in our main program, when we want to print out the numbers in the array, let's say the match numbers, we're going to say if that number is not 0, right? So it's going to be a problem, because if the number is not 0, right, instead of -1s, there will be zeros, zeros, zeros here. And if we say if the number is not 0, then print it out. it's still going to go ahead and print out 9 and 3, right? But then 0 was part of the match because the user had 0 as part of the lottery numbers. It's comparing 0 and 0 and saying, okay, there's a match here. But if we are displaying the lottery numbers by saying if the number is not 0, then that's a problem. It wouldn't display 0 as part of a match. So I know it's confusing, but you know, maybe it makes a little bit of sense, right? But for now, you get a better sense. Let's keep it at -1, right? Because -1 we know is not part of the lottery numbers, and it will work out perfectly. Okay. All right. So, and maybe once we get the program working, I'll also explain better, and I think you get a better sense. So we are first of all initializing an array called match numbers. When you initialize it for the first time, by default, the values will be 0, 0, 0, 0, assuming that we're dealing with 5 lottery numbers. I want us to first of all change the values from 0, 0, 0, 0, 0 to -1, -1, -1, -1, -1. We do that with a loop. Same idea as this. I'm going to create a for loop. I'm going to create a target variable to access the element in the array. Using basically the target variable is going to be the index. I'm going to call it. It's going to be an integer. I'm going to call it for int current matched number index. I'm going to set it to 0 as long as our current match number index is less than the length of our match numbers array. See, same idea. We do what's in the loop, and before we come back up to check to see if the current match number index is less than the match numbers length. Remember, the indices. Okay, each particular index will be always be less than the length of the array we are dealing with. So we check that condition. If that's true, we do what's in the loop, and then before we come back up and check the condition again, we add 1 to our index. But by doing this, we're basically going through the array. All right, so each time we want to store the number -1 in that particular slot. So each time in the match numbers array, using that particular slot, okay, we're accessing that particular slot by the index, by the current match number index, and we are storing the number -1 in that slot. So by the time this is done, the array will look something like this. We are setting each slot to -1. Oops. Something like this. So the array will stay something like this, and then we will basically compare the numbers in the two arrays. And if there is a match, what we want to do is we want to store that number using our current user lottery number index to actually point to that number. We are storing that number, okay, in our match numbers array, okay. So when there's a match in our matched numbers array, using the index, okay, because 0 will be the first index of the first index. Sorry, 0 is going to be used to access the first element of both arrays, right? If the index is 1, that's going to be used to access the second element of both arrays. Because the match numbers array also has the same number of elements, and we can use the index to also point to the exact position we're dealing with, we can use that index to store that matched number in the perfect slot. If it's the second number that matched, it will store it here. If it's the fourth number that matched, it will store it here. We'll replace the -1 and store it there because we are using that index, okay, which is the same index we are using to go through the two arrays, okay, to store that number in match numbers. So the good thing is we are first of all storing the match numbers in this array. At the same time, we are storing it in the right position. We know that, okay, if the match number is stored here, which is, let's say, for example, 9, we know that, okay, it's the second slot. If we know that, let's say, there's a match number 3 stored here, we know, okay, we're dealing with the fourth slot. We can later on in our other program access that index and use it to do other things. Okay. So each time we are storing the match number in the match numbers array using the particular index of that match number. Okay, and we are storing the match number there. Okay, and then the match number will be the particular number. It doesn't matter if you are getting it from the user's lottery numbers array or the lottery numbers array. They will be the same number. So we want that number. We want to store it in our match numbers array. Okay. And when we are done doing this, I want us to return our match numbers array to the program or the code that call the compare lottery numbers method. We defined it to return an integer array, so we want to return our match numbers integer array. So return our match numbers array. Okay, so we're done with this method. Okay, I know it's a bit confusing, but I want us to understand it, and that's why I'm taking my time to go through it. Right? That's how I'll do this program. I'll take my time and I'll go through it as well. And I think it helps me. It makes it clear in my mind when I'm coding. That's how I go about them. All right, go step by step. All right, so we're done with the compare lottery numbers array. Now it says, in addition, the class should also have a method that returns a copy of the lottery numbers array. So we have our lottery numbers array. The class, we should have a method in the class that returns this lottery numbers array to our other program, our main program. Okay, we're going to have two programs. Okay, the other one is that's going to test this class. So I'm going to create another instance method. I'll create it somewhere here. It doesn't matter. So it's going to be a public method. A return type. Let's see. It said the class should have a method that returns a copy of the lottery numbers array. Lottery numbers array is an integer array. So this method here is going to return this array here, which is an integer array. So public, the return type is going to be an integer array. Let's call this get lottery numbers. And get lottery numbers is not going to accept in an argument because all it's doing, it's returning the lottery numbers array. And so we're going to set it or specify it to return our lottery numbers array. This way, we're done with that. So I think that we are done with the class, because over here it says demonstrate the class in a program that asks the user to enter 5 numbers. And that's what we're going to do now. We're going to create the other program. First of all, let's compile this to see if we have any errors. I'm going to hit compile, and I'm going to create a new folder here in our chapter 7 folder where we're creating all our programs. I'm going to call it lottery. What's the name of this program? Is it lottery application? I think so. Yeah, lottery application. And then create. And I'm going to create this file here, which is our class, in this folder. All right, so we don't have any errors. Compilation completed. All right, so I'm going to create another file, okay? And I'm going to go ahead and save it. Well, before that, let's go ahead and create this program, right? So it's going to be a public. Let's create a class. So it's public class, and I'll call this class lottery application test. So lottery application test. And I'm going to go ahead and create the main method. So public static void main. Okay. Let's first of all compile this and try to save it. Okay, so I'm going to save the lottery applications test.java file in the same location where I save the class. When I do this and I try to create an object from our lottery application class, it should work. They should be able to talk to each other because you're in the same location. If you don't have the class saved where your main program, your program that's going to test the class is saved, if you don't have your class saved there, you need to specify to your program, your main program, where you're going to use to test the class. You need to specify to it where your class is. Otherwise, you're going to have problems. But because I'm saving the class and the program that's going to test the class in the same folder, I don't have an issue. They should be able to talk with each other when I try to create an object from this class in our lottery application test program. I'm going to do just that. Okay, so I'm done. I'm going to make a copy of the question so I can refer it from there too. So let's do this. Okay. All right, so demonstrate the class in a program that asks the user to enter 5 numbers. So since we're going to be asking the user to enter input, we can either use the G-option pane or the scanner class, okay, or some kind of feature to access or to get information from the user. I'm going to use the scanner class for this one. It's just a choice. You can use the G-option pane class as well. And so to use the scanner class, we need to import that class so the program can have access to it. So I'm going to import java.util.scanner. Okay, so in order to use the scanner class, we need to create a scanner object. So we can use the scanner object to accept information from the user and use a method in the scanner class to convert that information to whatever data type we want it to be. I'm going to create a scanner class type variable, a class type variable of scanner type. I'm going to call it keyboard because we're going to accept information from the keyboard. Now I just have a class type variable. I need to now create the object, the scanner object. So I'm going to set it equal to a new scanner object in memory. And I'm going to pass in system.in, and system.in is going to accept byte info from the keyboard, from the user. And basically, because I have it connected to the scanner class, we can use the methods in the scanner class to convert whatever byte information that the system.in method accepted. And we can convert it to whatever data type we want it to be converted to. All right. So before that also, we need to specify the number of lottery numbers we're going to be dealing with in this particular game. We need to specify that in some kind of a constant, or as a constant, because when we try to create an object from our lottery application class, we need to provide the number of lottery numbers. And so I'm going to store that value in as a constant. Before our scanner, object here, I'm going to declare a constant. Well, let's do this. I'll just spread this a little bit. All right, so I'm going to create a final int, right? And I'm going to call this number of lottery numbers. Oops, let me just call this way. Number of lottery numbers. I'm using this convention because constants are named by convention, public convention. It's not so there's a public convention by programmers to have uppercase and then multiple words are separated by underscores. So number of lottery numbers is going to be equal to, I'm just going to set it to 5, what the question is asking, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 integers. Okay, name an array of 5 integers. I'm going to set it to 5, but the beautiful thing is we can change this later on, and we don't have to change anything else in the program. The program just knows, it just manipulates itself. All right, so we have our scanner, we have our constant. Let me just tighten this up a little bit. Now let's go ahead and create an object from this class. Okay, so I'm going to create a lottery application class type variable, basically a class type variable that's going to store a lottery application object. I'm going to call this, let's say, World Lottery. That's just a name of think of it as a name of a lottery company or something. That's our object, right? I've created a class type variable that's going to hold a lottery application object. Think of this. Anytime you do something like this, you create an integer and you call it, say, number, and you call it number. Think of it this is the type, right? And this is the name of the variable. You can think of the lottery application as a type, and you can think of this as the name of the variable. But when you try to create an object from this class this way, Java is going to notice that the lottery application is not part of the primitive data types like int or doubles or char or something else. And so it's going to look in that folder to see if there's a lottery application class that exists, right? If there's a lottery application class that exists, it's going to say, okay, you are creating this variable because later on you're going to store a lottery application object in it, okay? That's why if your class is not stored in the folder where you have this program saved also, if your class is not saved there, you need to specify to this program where your class is. Otherwise, you're going to have problems. All right, so now this is just a variable that's going to hold a lottery application object. I'm now going to go ahead and create a new lottery application object in memory. And we defined the constructor in such a way that it's going to, whoever, in this case it's me, right? I'm writing the code. I need to specify the number of lottery numbers, right? And I have that stored here. So I can use our constant here, 5. Okay, so we've basically created an object from this class, and we've set our lottery numbers field to this length, which is 5. And so all the other arrays, arrays which we're going to create are going to have 5 in it because we're going to use this value here. compile this. We have an error somewhere. So let's see. I missed Y here. It's going to be lottery and not lottery. I missed the Y here. So I'm going to put it here back, compile, and we're good. All right. So demonstrate the class in a program that asks the user to enter five numbers, right? So that's going to be whatever the length this is. So I'm going to create a loop because I don't want to do this manually. I don't want to ask the user 5 times manually. I'm going to use a loop that's going to ask the user 5 times to enter their 5 numbers. Okay, I'm going to use this. This again represents a number of lottery numbers. So if you have an array and there are 5 numbers in there, okay, now remember the index or the indices of the array is always less than the length of the array. Right? So if it's an array of 5 numbers, all the indices will be less than 5. 5 will be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. These are going to be the indices. So same idea, we're going to create a for loop that's going to go through each of our arrays, which are going to have 5 numbers. So we can use this number actually as our length, right? Because this is going to be the length of all the arrays. So we can actually use this constant value here. Or we can also use the length of our array if we want. But the length of the array is going to be basically this. This is what we are using to create the length of the array. So why not just use this value? So this time around, I'm going to construct it a little bit different, but it's going to be the same. We're going to create a target variable. I'm going to call, what we're doing here is we're asking the user to basically to provide their let's say their lottery numbers. So I'm going to create a target variable. It's going to be for int, how do we call this? Current lottery number index. Yeah, we are asking the user to type in their lottery number. So we can call this for int current lottery number index is equal to 0. You can call this current user lottery number index or something if you want. But lottery number index also works. So for int current lottery number index is equal to 0 as long as our current lottery number index is less than, now in the other programs we use the length of the array. Now the length of the array is going to be 5 for each of all our arrays. And so why not just use this number 2? So as long as the current lottery number index is less than 5 or whatever value is here, because that's going to be our length of the array. Even if we use our length of the array, it's going to be the same thing. So it's the same thing as using this constant value here. So we check to see if the index is valid. We do what's in the loop, and before we come back up to check this condition, we set or we increase current lottery number index by 1. All right. And each time we want to ask the user to enter a value. So I'm going to have our system.out.println, and I'm going to say, please enter lottery application. Oh, sorry. Let's say please enter lottery number. Now I don't want to type in 1 or 2 manually, but I can use the index, the current lottery number index, to display some kind of a friendly message. If I just use current lottery number index like this, the first time it's going to say please enter lottery number 0 because it starts from 0, right? But that doesn't make sense. But 0 is really an index that refers to the first element. 1 is really an index that refers to the second element. 2 is an index that refers to the third element. So all we have to do to the index here is to add 1 to it to refer to our element. If it's index 0, then we're really dealing with our first element. We add 1 to the index and we get our actual position of the element, right? This first element has an index 0. Second element has an index 1. So if we want to say please, and if we want to refer to the first element, it's really using this index, right? But if we want to display a personalized information to the user, we add the number 1 to it. All right, so index plus 1, right? Well, this is index 0 for the first time, but then it will say 0 plus 1, which is 1, because we're actually referring to the first element. We're saying please enter lottery number 1, right? If it's index 1, we are adding 1 to it, and index 1 is actually referring to the second element. So 1 plus 1 is 2, so please enter lottery number 2. I'm going to surround them with parentheses because I don't want this value here being concatenated to the string, right? And I want this to be processed. So I'll do this. Once I display this message, let me just end with semicolon. Once I display this message, now I want to ask the user to enter some information, right? So I'm going to use, whoop, I spelled this wrong. I meant to type keyboard. Okay, keyboard. So now I'm going to use a scanner object here, and I'm going to call keyboard.nextInt. Now, keyboard.nextInt is going to pop up some kind of text box, and it's going to allow the user to type in the value. Now, whatever the user types is going to be sent back to us. It's going to be returned as an integer, right? As an int. And so we need a place to store it, right? So I'm going to come back up here and create an integer value, an int value. I'm going to call it user lottery number, because that's going to be a user lottery number. And so we're going to use a user lottery number is going to store whatever value that the user has typed, which is being converted to an integer, or which is being returned back to us as an integer. We're going to store it here. And what do we want to do with this user lottery number? We want to, before we go back up and ask the user for the next number, we want to store this number in an array. And so I'm going to come up here and declare an integer array, and I'm going to call it user lottery numbers. This is an array called user lottery numbers. The beautiful thing is, now once we have the number, we in our user lottery numbers array, we can, in that particular slot, because we are using an index, we refer to that index. If we are referring to index 0, that's the first element. So in that index, in that first element of this user lottery numbers array as well, we are storing our user lottery number before we go ahead and ask for the second number. As the second number, the index goes up, we check to see if the index is a valid index. But we use that index to display a nice information to the user. We take the user's value and store it in the next slot of the user lottery numbers array, so on and so forth. So by the time this loop is done, we'll have the user lottery numbers array stored. Filled with the user's number. Now what next? Let's compile this, see if we have errors. Yeah, we do. So let's see. Variable user lottery numbers might not have been initialized, which is true, right? So what we did over here was we declared a user lottery numbers class type variable, but we didn't define how many numbers this user lottery numbers array is going to store. What we should have done was we should have set it to the number of lottery numbers, right? So we've only defined a class type variable. We need to set it to, we now create the array. We're creating a new integer array, and we need to specify the length of it, and the length is going to be the number of lottery numbers. So now we have a specific length for it. It's going to store, let's say, 5 numbers in this case. And so if our number of lottery numbers is 5, if all the arrays are going to store 5, okay, this value here, then we can use an index to refer to the particular slot of each of the arrays and then store the lottery number in there, right? Compile this now, and that's fixed. All right, so when this is done, we'll have the user's lottery number, user's lottery numbers array filled. Now that we have this, there's a method in here. Remember, there's a method in here. The question said here that the class should have a method that accepts an array of 5 integers that represent a person's lottery picks, and that method was get user lottery numbers, right, which receives an integer array. So we can call it using our object, which is called world lottery, right? Where is it? Where is it? Right here. Okay, which is just called world lottery. So once we are done creating the users array, we can over here call world lottery dot. We're using the dot operator, or the access operator, to access this method called get user lottery numbers. We can call it and get lottery numbers accept in something. It accept in the user's lottery number given, like basically an integer array, which is going to be our users lottery numbers, right? Which we have already initialized. By the time the loop is done, we'll have it already initialized, and so we're going to pass in this user lottery numbers array, and so that this method will store the user's lottery numbers array in this array of that particular object, of this particular world lottery object. Okay, and by the time we do this, our world lottery object is going to have its lottery numbers initialized with random numbers, and it's going to have also its user lottery numbers because we just gave it to it. And so we can now call the method compare lottery numbers here, right? That's also in in the class. And so we can also call world lottery dot compare lottery numbers and compare lottery numbers does not accept in any arguments, but it just does all the comparison, and it returns an array called match numbers. Now remember, if the array is going to return us something like this. By first of all, when you create them, they will all have zeros stored in there. We change the values from zeros to -1s. But if there is a match, according to, let's say, this example, 7 here, there's no match here. In this particular position, there's no match here. There's no match here. There's a match here. This is at index 2. Okay, so we're going to store it also at index 2 of this match numbers array. So because there's no match at the first and second, it will stay at first and second will stay at 0, -1, and -1. But at the third position, there was a match, and that number was 9. And at the fourth position, there was no match, and so it will stay at -1. At the last position, there was a match, and that's 3. So by the time, with this, if the numbers indeed are these numbers, right? If the numbers in both arrays are these numbers, then the match numbers will return an array like this. If we want to display the match numbers, we're going to loop through this array, and we're going to say, okay, if the number we want to display is not equal to -1, okay, if it's not equal to -1, then print it out. If it's equal to -1, don't print it out. So if it's not equal to -1, which is 9 and 3, print it out. So it's going to display 9 and 3. The beautiful thing is we can use an index. This has index 2, this has index 4, to display the slots, right? Because index 2 is really the third slot. So we can say, we can access its index and add 1 to it to say, okay, there's a match at 9 at slot 3. Because we took its index and added 1 to it. We took index 2 and added 1 to it, so we have slot 3. We can say, okay, there's a match, there's a match which is the number 3 at slot 5, right? Because this 3 here has an index of 4. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. But index, we can add 1 to it to say, okay, this is at slot 5, because when you're counting from 1, you're dealing with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's the beauty of returning this array here. All right, so we can call this compare lottery numbers method. We know it's going to return a match numbers array, which is an integer array. And so we need a place to store it if it's going to return an integer array. I'm going to come up here and declare an integer array, class type variable. I'm going to call it match numbers. It doesn't matter if the names are the same. The scope of this array is within this main method here in another file, and then the scope of this array is within the compare lottery numbers method in this file. So they are like twins again, but they're not the same. Okay, so match numbers, now this is just a class type variable, a reference variable that's just going to hold an array, an integer array. I'm going to set it equal to, right? The reason why we set match numbers to the length of the lottery numbers array is because the maximum number of match numbers you can have is 5, right? So we set it to the length first of all. So it's possible you can match all numbers, and it's possible you can match some numbers. If you match some numbers, the array will look like this. There will be some -1s in there. If you match all numbers, then the array will be filled with actual numbers. There will never be any -1, because if there's a match, it replaces the -1 and puts an actual number here, like 9 and 3. And so I'm going to create a match numbers array here to set its length. Same idea. The length is going to be 5, whatever, the lottery numbers, or whatever number of lottery numbers there are. So I'm now going to create an array, because this is just a class type variable that's going to hold an array. I'm going to create a new integer array, same as this. And I'm going to set it to the number of lottery numbers, this way. And so once we call world lottery number compare lottery numbers, it's going to return the match numbers array, and we're going to store it here in our match numbers array in our main method here. And so match numbers is going to be equal to whatever is being returned when we call world lottery compare lottery numbers. So now, well, what do we have? We have our match numbers here. First of all, let's display the user's lottery. Let's display, actually, in a regular lottery number game, we can display, okay, we can say the today's lottery numbers are, right? we can do that, right? But before that, we need a copy of the actual lottery numbers. Currently, it's just in the object itself. So that's why the question also said over here that in addition, the class should have a method that returns a copy of the lottery numbers array. So in our object here, okay, when we go back to the class, each object will have a field here, lottery numbers, which will be initialized when we create that object. There is a method called get lottery numbers, which returns lottery numbers for us. We can call it and have access to it. Right, so we can say world lottery, okay, dot, and we can call that method, which is called get lottery numbers. Right, so world lottery dot get lottery numbers, it doesn't accept any argument, but it returns a copy of the lottery numbers, the actual lottery numbers. Okay, not the user's lottery numbers. This is the actual lottery numbers. It returns that copy, which is an integer array, and so we need to come up here and declare another integer array. I'm going to call it lottery numbers, actual lottery numbers, right? It's just, again, it doesn't matter if they're the same names. They're like twins, but they're not the same. Two different location, two different scope. Okay. So int lottery numbers is also going to be. I'm now going to create a new integer array. The length of it is going to be the number of lottery numbers. Because when the object was created, it was created with this number here. And so if you're creating an array that's going to receive this array here, if you're creating an array in the main method that's going to receive this array here, it also has to be of the same length, and that's why we're using, number of lottery numbers. So it's very important you do this. It kind of makes your program very consistent and nice. No errors.